Hi everyone, in this video we're going to quickly take a look at a few different methods for creating keyframes in Maya. We can use keyframes to create motion for various different types of objects, cameras, lights, 3D models, curves, all sorts of different things. And we can also keyframe attributes within things like material shaders, and various other settings within things like cameras. You know, we can, for example, adjust the camera zoom using animation. So we're just going to quickly go over a few basic methods for creating keyframes for beginner users of the software. Okay, so so that I've got something to kind of demonstrate this stuff, what we're going to do is just use a sphere. This will do. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a material onto this to change the sphere's color. So I'm just going to right click on that, go to assign favorite material. I'll just load a blend onto this for the time being. And over here I'm just going to create a red color for this. And this is purely so that it's a little bit easier to see, and also we can take a look at some keyframe options in that material later on. Okay, so basically the first method for adding keyframes to our object is to come up to the channel box, have that open. That's the button up in the upper right hand corner here. And I'm going to select the ball, and I've got my timeline indicator here on frame 1. And the quickest, easiest method for creating some kind of keyframe on the object is to press the S key, which is set key, like that. Now you'll notice when you do that, two things happen. The first is that you see this little red timeline keyframe appear just here on the current frame, and also we get this series of red indicators running down the channel box attributes for the object. So that's indicating that we are currently on a frame that has keyframes for these settings. Okay, so the set key option basically will keyframe every unlocked channel visible here in the channel box. Now if we pop into our animation menu set just here, okay, and we come up to the key menu, you can see that the set key option is just here, and S is the shortcut for that. That's the keyboard shortcut we've just created. Now if I pop across to the animation tab, I can see that option just there, set key. Okay, so that's sort of keyframe technique 1. The second way of creating a keyframe, I'm just going to move down the timeline here. The second way we can create a keyframe is by selecting channels over here in the channel box and manually setting keyframes on those selected channels. So let's say I'm going to move my sphere across in the positive X direction. So that's translate X, and I've just moved this. If I now select that channel and I hold down the right mouse button or right click, I get a menu and I can key the selected channel by hitting key selected. And you can see that that now adds a keyframe in for translate X at 20 frames. So now if I scrub back and forth between frame 1 and frame 20, I can see that I'm getting some movement there. So on frame 1, we've keyframed every available channel, indicated by these red indicators, and on frame 20, we've keyframed only the selected channel, and that's the channel that we modified by moving the ball. Now you'll notice that the other channels have these pink indicators rather than the red indicator. What this means is that somewhere on the timeline, these channels have a keyframe, but it's not the current time that we're on, which is frame 20, because they're pink and not red. The only channel at frame 20 that's been keyframed is translate X, as indicated by this red marker just here. Okay, so those are sort of two main basic ways of keyframing objects. I'm going to show you another option now where we can create keyframes within attributes of objects or materials. Okay. Now, before I do that, notice that the movement in between my two keyframes is basically set up so that the movement speeds up and then slows down. That's easing out and easing in. And that's the default setting for Maya for its animation curves, or it's what's called tangents. Okay. So it'll automatically try and accelerate and then decelerate between keyframes. Okay. Or at least from the first keyframe through to the last keyframe in your movement. Okay. Now we're going to come back to keyframing in a similar manner to this a bit later on. But first I want to show you keyframing some attributes. So what we're going to do is with the object selected, I'm going to go back to frame 1, and I'm going to go to the attribute editor just here, and that's this icon up here in the top right. Normally if you click all of these icons on, they should create tabs down the side. You might find something like tool settings will pop up as a floating panel, and you can drag that across into sort of this little tab row, and when it highlights blue down here, you can just drop it and it'll create a tab. Okay, so let's create a keyframe to change the color of the ball. So within the attribute editor, I select my ball and I come across to my blend material tab. Okay, this is what we added a bit earlier on to make the ball red. Now I can see the color here, and what I'm going to do is keyframe this attribute. So I'm on frame 1. I'm going to hold down or right click on the word color just here. Now you'll notice that when I hover over it, I get a little list icon next to my cursor. So that means that I can right click on it to access a menu. And what I have here is a set key option. So if I click that, it's going to keyframe the current color of the object at frame 1. So that's red. And you can see I've actually got an input connected there. Okay, and that's that keyframe. Now, if I change the color by clicking on, actually, sorry, I've got to move to my next frame. I'm going to do these on the same frames I did before. So move your timeline indicator to your next frame, then click on the color and select a different color. So I might go with something like a light blue. Then what we're going to do is right click again on the word color and hit the set key option just there. So now if I jump back to frame 1, you can see that the ball has reverted to red. If I scrub through, the ball will change color as it moves between those two keyframes. So any options or any attributes that we have within the attribute editor that has this little menu icon will most likely have a set key option, and it doesn't have to be just within the material. Potentially we could have options to keyframe things within these other attributes. Okay, so you can see here the tangent smoothing angle, for instance. I can right click that and I can set a key there. So a lot of these attributes actually have animatable options within them. So if you run down the list and you know, have a hunt around, you might be able to find some additional settings that you can animate to come up with some new effects and animation processes. Okay, so that's basic keyframing and keyframing attributes within an object. So now I want to have a look at adding a different type of keyframe by adjusting the tangents of the animation. Now, to give you a quick idea of what the tangents are, I'm going to come up to the Windows menu, and I'm going to go to my animation editors menu and select graph editor. So this is the graph editor of this current animation. This is showing the movement graph of this animation. Okay. Now this is only the movement of the ball. It is not the the color change. The color change is within this blend material, and in order to see that, we would have to select this blend tab and then click the select button to select this particular node within the software. We might take a quick look at that now. If I select that, you can see that my blend selects, and my red, green, and blue colors, which are mixed together to form the color that we see here, you can see that these lines are changing, and that's basically the values changing for the color. So you can see it starts on red, where red is at 1. So that's red is switched on. And the green and blue are down here at 0, which means they're switched off, which means at this point, at frame 1, all we can see is red. And then over the period of 20 frames, the red curve turns down to a 0 value, so it switches off. And the blue color switches on up to a value of 1, so blue is completely turned on, and green is at roughly about 0.5. And so what we're getting is a mix of solid blue plus like 50% green, which is going to give us that light blue color as the ball reaches that position. So that's sort of how it will visually represent a color change. Okay, I'm going to go back to the ball, and you can see that the movement there, which is this translate X value, that was the only one we actually moved, basically is creating this S curve. Where the curve is horizontal, where this red line is horizontal, there is little to no movement. When it's absolutely horizontal, there is no movement. So what's happening here is the movement begins sort of here, and we get across to here. There is very little movement in the ball. You can see it's only tweaking maybe about a pixel. Okay, as the curve becomes steeper, the ball accelerates, and at this point, essentially, it's moving at its maximum speed, because that's as steep as the curve gets. As it starts to move into this final keyframe, it's starting to ease in. So what that means is it's slowing down as it approaches this keyframe, because the curve is becoming more horizontal again. So we start to see a slowdown. So here it's slowly starting to move, and then it accelerates to maximum speed here. And then from there it starts to slow down until it reaches here and it stops. So that's sort of how that curve is read. Okay, so what we are going to do is change the way that the software generates these curves. So rather than it becoming this sort of soft ease out and then ease in curve, what we are going to do is create a stepped curve. Okay. So what I'm going to do is sort of place this here, and I'm going to delete that animation. So I'm just going to rewind back to the beginning, and I'm going to delete those keyframes. So I'm just selecting those keyframes, selecting the curve, and then pressing delete. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into the software options, or the software preferences. A quick shortcut button for that is down here. It's a little man with a little gear next to him. So I can click that. You can also get to these these settings or these options by going to the Windows menu and then down to Settings Preferences and then selecting Preferences. On a Macintosh computer, you'll have a little Apple logo up in the upper left corner of your screen. If you click on that, actually what you'll have is you'll have a little apple, and then you'll have it'll say Maya. It'll have an actual menu with the software name on it. If you click on that, it'll then have a preferences option in there as well. For safety's, sort of for a surefire, safe way of getting to that menu, I always use the Windows menu, Settings Preferences, just here. That way I know that I'm getting to that panel. Okay, so what we're going to do is change the way that curve is generated by default. So within the Preferences panel, if I come to the Animation option just here in this Categories list, and I look for the Tangents option just here, what I'm going to do is set the default out tangent from Auto, which is basically an auto smoothing curve, which is what we saw before, to Stepped. Okay. Now, you'll notice that in the default in tangent, there is no option for stepped. And that's because the stepped function only works sort of from a keyframe moving out to the next keyframe. So it's a default out tangent option only. So what we'll do is hit save. Now, when we're not using that, we need to remember to revert that setting back to its normal default. Otherwise, it'll play havoc with other people using our computers for their 3D animation. Okay, so let's do basically the same keyframes that we did before. Now, I'm going to do one little twist here. What I'm going to do is use the auto key button just down here. So if I click this button on, it'll go red. And once I've created one manual keyframe for the object, after that, it will automatically create keyframes for any channels that I adjust or any movements or rotations or scales that I make. So what I'm going to do is, same as before, just pop back over to the channel box. So I'm just going to press S to set a keyframe on frame 1 for the sphere. Then I'm going to move down to frame 20. You can see that that's occurring just here. I can zoom out on the graph as well in the same way that I would within the viewport. So frame 20, I'm going to move the sphere across. And you can see now what's happened is the line or the curve that it's created in the graph is no longer this S curve that comes up to here. It's a straight line that runs across to frame 20. Okay. Now, in order to see what this is doing, I've got to actually create some more keyframes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come across to frame 45. I'm then going to move across again, just a little bit. And if I just increase the size of this and hit A on the keyboard, you can now see I've got this line and then another keyframe and then this line, then another keyframe. And if I go to maybe 70 and I adjust there, then I'll put my cursor in the graph and press A. That zooms the graph out to the entire graph. You can see now what I'm getting is this stepped or staircase looking graph. Now, just to show you that it doesn't have to always go up like this, I'm going to go to the next keyframe, and this time I'm going to go back the other way. Okay, and you can see that that has actually gone to there. So if I move that back, so you can see there it goes, steps up and then steps down. Okay, so let's take a look at what that's actually doing. So I'm going to go back to frame 1. So if I start to run down the timeline like this, if I scrub down the timeline, you'll see that from frame 1 to frame 20, nothing happens except for the color change. Okay, and that's still there from before. But the movement, the way this works is once I hit frame 20, the object will jump to its new position. Then it'll sit, and then on frame 45 where the next keyframe is, it will jump to the next position. And so on and so forth. So what this is doing, it's sort of working, you could imagine that this is almost like a stop motion animation. Okay, it's just one position after the next. Now I've spaced these out, okay, but technically speaking, if you did them on every frame, if you did, you know, a position for every frame 1, 2, 3, or every second frame, if we animated on 2s, frame 1, frame 3, frame 5, 7, and so on, you could basically animate this the way that you would create a stop motion animation. Or even, you know, if you imagine the positions of this being drawings, it would be essentially like a traditional hand-drawn animation. So we can simulate those other kind of animation styles by adjusting the way that the graph is produced as far as the tangents coming in and out of these keyframes. Now technically you could modify these tangents afterwards. If I select a tangent here, for example, you can see currently it's set to stepped. If I switch it back to, if I turn stepped, if I go back to this one here, so spline tangents, you can see now what I get is basically this handle which I can then adjust. So now in between, what's that, frame 45 and frame 70, what I should get is actually, rather than stepped movement, I should actually get normal movement going from there. So let's test that out. So frame 1 to 20, it's step movement. Frame 20 to 45, it's stepped. And then from here, it should actually just move like that. And then from there, 70, it's going to be stepped, and then 85 to 95 is stepped again. So you can have a combination of stepped movement and smoothed out, spline type movement. But if you want to simulate something that's quite robotic, or very clicky movement, or something more like a stop motion style, you can set all your tangents to stepped. So don't forget the auto key button is on. So when we're not using that, it's a good idea to turn it off, because if we're not aware of that being on and we accidentally keyframe something and then start moving objects around and changing times on the timeline, it'll actually start kind of creating animation without us knowing it. Okay. And the final thing I'm going to do is revert my keyframe tangents, my auto tangents, back to their original settings. So I'm going to go back into that preferences window. So I'll just click the little man button down there, go back to animation, and I can either go back into here, default out tangent, and switch this back to auto, or what I could do, if I haven't changed any other settings that I might like as default, technically what you could do is go to edit and hit restore to default settings, and that'll basically change everything to its original factory settings. But if you've got other settings that you've adjusted, then you might not want to do that, because it'll change all of those and you'll have to fix them up. So default out tangent, just switch back to auto, and then hit save. So that's a few different methods for keyframing. So I'm going to leave this video here, and I'll see you next time.